Saddam rockets blast Israel.
We will not fail. Tonight, What the Papers Say is presented by David Langston, a freelance reporter on Middle East affairs.
Masa al-Khair, as we say in the free world of peace-loving Middle East democracies, and welcome to January the 18th. For a while there, I didn't think we'd make it. According to latest reports, much of the Iraqi Air Force and war machine didn't.
Desert storm hits Iraq.
Gulf War. Massive U.S. air bombardment of Iraq.
Air bombardment opens the war against Saddam.
War.
Blitz on Baghdad.
Baghdad.
Crushed.
That front page from The Sun is about a different battle from earlier in the week. Anyone remember Lithuania?
Lithuania has no oil, but like Kuwait, wants freedom.
People power. A protester's banner bears a message for Moscow.
That message was buried by the events of Thursday, along with the 14 dead Lithuanians. As Britain and her newspapers went to bed on Wednesday night, television broke the news that Desert Shield had become Desert Storm.
At 3:45 a.m. local time, Bernard Shaw, a CNN correspondent in Baghdad, held his microphone out of a hotel window and picked up sustained anti-aircraft fire.
They're unloading and leaving. The sky looks like 1,000 fireflies up to the southwest, just like sparklers on the 4th of July.
That was a special edition of the International Herald Tribune. On the ground in Saudi Arabia, U.S. Air Force Colonel Ray Davies told the official Gulf press pool, reported The Independent,
"It's awesome. The ground shook. This is history in the making. It's absolutely awesome. The ground shook and you felt it."
In the early hours of the morning, all of the British papers remade their front pages for this monumental event. The Guardian, despite its consistent opposition to war in the Gulf, gave full and comprehensive coverage of that morning's outbreak of war, remaking several inside pages and, unusually, rewriting its editorial to reflect on the massive destruction underway. The lead.
Bombs rained down on Baghdad and other targets in Iraq and Kuwait last night as the long months of waiting in the Gulf crisis finally ended.
The liberation of Kuwait has begun.
President Bush's spokesman, Marlon Fitzwater, said,
Metaphorically speaking, it was actually the bombing of Baghdad. But the triumphalism of Thursday's surgical strikes was transformed into cold reality on the front pages today.
Iraqi missiles strike Israel.
Iraqis hit back with Scud missiles attacks on Israel.
4 a.m., Iraq blitz on Israel.
Saddam rockets blast Israel.
Saddam Hussein had threatened for weeks to draw Israel into the conflict, and The Guardian summed up in its front page lead,
The Iraqi strikes came exactly 24 hours after President Bush unleashed the air assault upon Baghdad.
and it warned about this morning's bombing of civilians.
The attack on Israel was the widening of the war which President Bush had most dreaded, throwing up alarming political implications for his Arab allies.
In any case, a fragile alliance. But even though we've been told that this morning's Iraqi Scud missiles have caused little material damage, the Independent's front page yesterday assessed precisely such strategic risks.
Anybody can start a war. Finishing it is the problem.
Saddam linked Israel with his Kuwait invasion very quickly. Here is the Jordan Times, 12 days after the invasion of Kuwait.
Saddam linked any Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait to an Israeli pullout from the West Bank and Gaza Strip.
Most papers pointed out that Saddam did not invade Kuwait for the Palestinians, but once there decided that they could serve his purposes. And so the word linkage was born.
Saddam sticks to hard line. Peace hopes fade as Iraq insists on Israel linkage.
A hard line, too, from the US State Department.
There is not any linkage. There won't be any linkage.
There wasn't much said about the linkage in the British press, except to say there wasn't any. But that narrowness of comment did not apply to newspapers nearer the conflict. In the Jerusalem Post, owned by the same company that owns the Daily Telegraph, and now described as a right-wing Israeli newspaper, law professor Leon Shelef said less than a month ago that
linkage is not a four-letter word. Whether we like it or not, Israel is a factor in the Gulf crisis. It has to acknowledge that there is a linkage and reassess its policy accordingly. Both Iraq and Israel are using their military power to maintain control over a hostile population.
Turning all Western media arguments on their heads, Professor Shelef said Israel should launch preemptive peace negotiations.
This, then, is the linkage. It is not a dirty word. It may be a unique opportunity, the key to a more secure future. Israeli initiative at this stage could significantly help lead to a peaceful solution to the Gulf crisis, which could rebound to Israel's credit. It could provide the right sort of political climate for an early resolution of the Palestinian issue.
That's ancient history now. All reporting is a matter of perspective, a fact not lost to the editor of the Baghdad Observer, Naji al-Hadithi. A long time ago, 7 days ago, he examined restrictions on the Western press.
Journalists in the West are engaged in almost daily confrontations with state officials who want to dictate their policies on both reporters and their newspapers. The United States, Britain and their allies have made their own neutral and free media blinkered drummers, seeing no more than the tips of their noses.
A comment echoed in the British press, which we'll look at in a moment. But I should point out that there is no discussion of Iraqi censorship in the Baghdad Observer, which is
Published by Department of Information, Baghdad.
a different Arab voice came from.
Al-Fajr,
That means the dawn.
Jerusalem Palestinian Weekly, the only English-language newspaper published in the occupied territories.
The editorial in this paper, subject to Israeli military censorship, called for peace. Referring to initiatives by Yasser Arafat and the French, Al-Fajr said of the United States, Britain and Kuwait,
Many hostile parties in our region and abroad are clearly dissatisfied with these peace efforts. They want military force to be employed immediately, no matter what the cost. Such an approach will bring catastrophe, not only to this region, but to the entire world.
we await with serious concern the vindication of that prediction. Israel's leading broadsheet daily,
Haaretz.
that means the land, reminded its readers of Israel's role in the Gulf crisis.
Ein Sibala Charog, Mimdiniyut, Chaprofil Hanamuch.
There is no reason to deviate from Israel's policy of low profile.
As we saw, a policy it studiously undertook even after a Scud missile attack. But the editorial ends with the keen understanding of what was, until Operation Desert Storm, the regional threat of Saddam Hussein.
Israel hopes that the world has learned the lesson of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and that the international effort will liberate the entire region from the Iraqi chemical, biological, and even nuclear threat which has been accumulated in its cellars. The United States masterminded this effort. If it succeeds, it'll be a blessing to us as well.
Calling for the now clearly lost opportunity of a peaceful solution, Haaretz said it was in Israel's best interest to cooperate with the international effort as best it can. It was confirmed yesterday that it had done so.
Saddam Hussein is aware of the strength of Israel, and he has said that he will attack us to dismantle the coalition between the United States, Egypt, Syria, and Saudi Arabia.
The reason for this morning's attack on Tel Aviv and Haifa, a point well reported by The Independent a week ago, by Carol Berger in Cairo.
The Egyptian president, Hosni Mubarak, told reporters that Egypt would oppose Israeli involvement.
If Israel intervenes,
He said,
Egypt will assume a different posture.
Which means they might change sides. Little comfort for our boys in the Gulf, in the front line with the Arab Defence Shield. What they might have missed from the Arab forces, they more than amply gain by support from the tabloids, who welcome war as they might a cup final.
Go get 'em, boys!
In a war which is for many morally dubious, the tabloids and all bar one of the broadsheets sought the comfort of the moral certainties of the past, echoing the words of Churchill,
The few.
Lord Nelson,
Britain expects, just as we expect our forces to do their duty by us, so we must and shall do our duty by them.
Kipling.
Lest we forget.
Today reminded us of Kitchener's message,
Your country needs him.
great and solemn words of national import. But for what purpose?
Girls, Gulf Heroes need you. Join the Sun Lonely Hearts Club.
And again in the sun?
Support our boys and put this flag in your window.
Oh, for that purpose, to sell newspapers and T-shirts.
Wear your patriotism on your chest.
I can't say anything to that.
Operation Desert Shield. Gulf Crisis. These colors don't run.
And that under a headline,
Countdown to war.
solemn stuff indeed. But if you'd been reading only British newspapers, you could be forgiven for thinking that there had never been any other option than war, as a near-unanimous preference of the country. While public opinion hardened slightly in favour of armed force, an ICM poll for The Guardian declared 54% were in favour of war, but a very respectable 45% opposed it. American polls were closer. In the same Guardian article, a Gallup poll published on the 15th of January, which came to be known as K-Day, Kuwait Day,
46% of people said the Gulf was worth going to war over, but 44% said no.
only The Guardian consistently cautioned Britain against war. No other newspaper retained for so long the window of optimism prayed for by The Guardian's editor, Peter Preston. Writing as the bombs fell on Baghdad, Preston accepted that war in all of its horror was underway. In which case, if it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly.
The simple cause at the end is just. An evil regime in Iraq instigated an evil and brutal invasion. Our soldiers and airmen are there at UN behest to set that evil to rights. Their duties are clear. There may be a time when doubts, the doubts that have plagued the past months, return. The world, at prime time for television, in sadness and apprehension, has embarked on a new chapter. No one, because war is like that, can tell how it will end.
On Wednesday, as the bombers taxied on their runways, the people of Amman, the Jordanian capital between Iraq and a hard place, read a leader in the Jordan Times chillingly headlined,
The day after. Through his words and deeds since August the 2nd, Mr. Bush has sought to put the Iraqi president in a corner from which there could be no way out, except perhaps through capitulation and humiliation. This is something that Saddam Hussein would never accept, and the Americans knew that.
Castigating the United States, the Jordan Times editor, George Hawatmeh, said the hypocrisy over the Palestinians was a mistake. He wrote ironically about America and its allies.
They are the purely altruistic, uniquely democratic regime which cares not a whit about its own self-interests and everything about equality and fairness for all peoples that the world has ever come to know. Javier Perez de Cuellar has vindicated the Americans. Saddam is the problem. He does not want to withdraw from Kuwait. Or does he? It is difficult to remember when the UN Secretary General last mentioned Security Council Resolutions 242 and 338.
Demanding Israel's withdrawal from the occupied territories.
Let alone asked for a deadline to implement them. Dare anyone ask him if they would ever send UN peacekeepers to protect Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, much less contemplate the dispatch of 450,000 troops to force Israel out of the occupied Arab territories?
Despite its polysyllables, an extraordinary editorial by Peregrine Worsthorne in the Sunday Telegraph belonged in the Sun along with offers of T-shirts. In his call to be discreet about the horrors of war, headed,
Keep the cameras out.
Worsthorne went off on something of a tangent into the richness of killing people for king and country. He ran an analogy between killing and sex.
War is not evil, any more than sex is evil.
And concluded that it should be a private matter. In his argument for privacy, censorship by another name, Worsthorne wrote,
When a man bayonets another man, he does not wish to be seen doing it. What the camera records is the ugliness, not the beauty.
The beauty?
The debasement, rather than the nobility. Of course, the ugliness is real. The camera does not invent it.
So why exclude it?
There is more to war than ugliness, just as there is more to love than lust. To die for one's country can be a sweet thing to do, and becoming.
Well, off you go, Perry. The veteran war correspondent John Pilger says the truth of war can only be revealed by its horror, and therefore must be shown. It was left to the Daily Mirror to give this point a human voice. This week, John Diamond asked his readers,
Just for a moment, forget about politics and imagine this. It is a couple of weeks from now, and you are your local MP.
and as that MP, you have to speak to a couple whose son has been killed in the Gulf.
What is it their boy has died for? Do you say that he's died fighting for that noblest of causes, democracy? Do you say that he's died fighting to rid the world of the iniquitous Iraqi regime? Why has Britain not gone to war to deal with the equally iniquitous regimes in a dozen other countries?
Another reason?
Perhaps you tell them that Saddam is really a murderous barbarian who's already loosed chemical weapons on that quarter of his country inhabited by the Kurds. Except Britain was helping to supply its then ally with some of those very weapons.
And John Diamond summed up.
If I were that MP, I would be hard put to make a good case for the soldier's death. He would have died interfering in a squabble between two countries in which we have no real interest. He would have died not to save democracy, but to save the manly face of a Western alliance which, having backed itself into a diplomatic corner, felt it could only come out of that corner fighting.
Tesbach al-Khair. Shalom, good night, and good luck.